Howdy friends, welcome back to The Proof. I'm Simon Hill, and today we are talking about one of the most powerful tools for better health, and that is fiber. Your gut microbiome, which is the trillions of microbes living inside you, affects everything from digestion, immunity, metabolism, and even your brain. And fiber is their favorite fuel. In this masterclass, I've pulled the best insights from world-leading experts, plus practical tips from myself to show you how to feed your gut, protect it from harm, and unlock its full potential. Let's get into it. Did you know you're only half human? It's true, your body contains roughly the same number of microbial cells as it does human cells. But these microbes, specifically bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea, are not invaders. They are your most powerful health allies. Which brings us to the first definition today, the microbiome. Your gut microbiome is not just a collection of bacteria. It's a dynamic ecosystem, a rainforest of these microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea. Primarily residing in your large intestine or colon, this community is incredibly diverse, with each microbe playing a very specific role in your health. So let's explore exactly how they do that, starting with your immune system. Firstly, microbes educate our immune system more than teachers. Think of them as scholars, training your immune system to distinguish between harmful pathogens and friendly microbes, helping to balance immune responses and reducing autoimmunity. Second, they protect your gut barrier. Microbes ferment or consume indigestible parts of our food that escape digestion in our small intestine and pass into our large intestine, producing specific fats known as short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Why is this important? Because these short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, are the peacekeepers of your gut lining. Butyrate, for instance, is the main fuel for the cells lining your colon. It helps strengthen the gut barrier, preventing what we call leaky gut, which is more accurately referred to as increased intestinal permeability. A strong gut barrier helps keep inflammation down by preventing harmful substances from entering circulation. Third, these microbes influence your brain and emotions. The gut-brain axis allows communication between your gut and brain, impacting mood, stress, and cognition. You've probably heard before that 90% of serotonin is made in the gut. And while this serotonin does not cross the blood-brain barrier, it can affect nerves that send signals directly to the brain. Microbes also influence your brain through the vagus nerve and by producing neurotransmitter precursors like tryptophan, which can cross the blood-brain barrier and affect mood, sleep, pain perception, etc. Microbes even influence your appetite and satiety, something we spoke about in a previous episode together. And beyond that, they're involved in regulating cholesterol, insulin sensitivity, and inflammation throughout the body. An imbalanced microbiome, what we call dysbiosis, is linked to conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, inflammatory bowel disease, allergies, and even neurodegenerative diseases. The exciting part? Unlike our genes, which are fixed, our microbiome is dynamic and highly responsive. What you eat, how you sleep, your stress levels, all of these influence the composition and function of our microbiome on the daily. In a matter of days, you can literally shift your microbiome from an ecosystem that is promoting disease to one that's promoting good health.
Let's talk about food and restoring microbe diversity. When it comes to our diet, if we want to encourage this very rich, diverse ecosystem of trillions of bacteria in a beautiful balance that are rewarding us, they're helping keep that mucosal layer nice and thick. Our intestinal cells are happy. They have an energy source. Inflammation's down. What are we doing from a dietary point of view?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and something that our lab is actively studying. If you look at all the data from both animal studies and now some more recent human studies, it looks like there's sort of two factors of diet that have emerged as important for a healthy microbiome. One we've talked a lot about, which is dietary fiber. So these complex carbohydrates we know is what these gut microbes rely on for their energy source. Our human genome doesn't encode much of a capacity to degrade them. So it's clear that we've rely on our gut microbes to digest these complex carbohydrates. Then they create all the small molecules Justin was talking about, short chain fatty acids and other chemical compounds that affect our physiology. So a diet rich in complex carbohydrates seems to be an important facet of maintaining a healthy microbiome. The other aspect of diet that looks like is going to be very important is the consumption of fermented foods. So these are foods that contain live active microbes that when people consume that food, it both lowers inflammation in general and also increases microbiome diversity. And so it's sort of that, again, back to that good and bad microbe situation. In the industrialized world, we don't want to go back to a place where we don't have access to antibiotics and we don't have access to clean water, but we also need to make sure that we're exposing ourselves to microbes, because that's, from an evolutionary standpoint, what our body is expecting. It's expecting to see microbes on a daily basis. And fermented foods, we think, is an easy and safe way to expose yourself to microbes in a way that's beneficial and doesn't expose ourselves to disease-causing bacteria. So fermented things like dairy products, yogurt, and then fermented vegetables like sauerkraut, kimchi. These things are just teeming with healthy bacteria that, when people consume them on a regular basis, improves microbiome diversity and helps with inflammation.
And we can also talk about like what is good to not have in the diet that may be beneficial for the gut microbiome. I think the Western diet, it turns out, is probably a model of what not to be eating when it comes to trying to foster a healthy microbiome. There's high sugar is probably some, or high glycemic foods, simple starches and things like that are probably problematic in multiple respects. One is providing a really rich kind of bacterial media environment in the small intestine. And we know that SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and other small bowel disorders are becoming more prevalent in industrialized countries. And this corresponds with just eating a diet that's really rich in simple nutrients. And if those simple nutrients exceed the absorptive capacity of the small intestine, that is, we can't get them into our bloodstream fast enough, it really creates a rich nutrient environment for bacteria to grow very rapidly within our small intestine, which is probably a huge deviation from the diet that humans had for most of our evolutionary history, which is a diet rich in plant material that has relatively low glycemic index. So I think that the simple nutrient diet may present a lot of problems for small intestinal microbiota overgrowth and weird metabolism to be occurring. I also think there's just, a lot of emerging data associated with emulsifiers, these chemicals in processed foods that increase shelf stability. These appear to be problematic from the standpoint of disrupting the mucus barrier. Artificial sweeteners appear to be problematic from the standpoint of misregulating the microbiota in various ways, and that can lead to metabolic syndrome, for instance, in animal models. So there's a lot of things that we're missing in our diet that are beneficial for the gut microbiota, and then a lot of things that are now included in the Western diet that are probably problematic for gut biology and the microbiota.
So if we kind of work on getting a few more whole plants in and fermented foods, that will start to nudge out, hopefully, some of that more ultra processed food with the simple sugars in there, or so we hope. You mentioned probiotics in fermented foods, and Justin and I did an episode on the study you did on fermented foods and fiber. I want to remind anyone about that. If you haven't listened, go back. There's a lot of detail in there. But that also gets me wondering about, just foods like an apple. When you grab an apple off the shelf, does that also contain some live bacteria or probiotics on it or within it, depending on how it's been cleaned or sanitized?
Probably very, very little. I think that certainly if you go into an orchard that's, an organic orchard or kind of neglected orchard that nobody's paying attention to and pick an apple, you're more likely to have microbes on it that may have some impact. But you have to remember that even in that situation, the microbial load will be incredibly small on that apple unless it's partially fermented and rotting there. And I think that, getting back to Erica's point about the fermented foods and the study that we performed that showed a positive impact of fermented foods, it's not hard to imagine why fermented foods might be so important, because certainly, for much of human history, fermented foods have been part of our diet. But even before we were intentionally fermenting foods, we were eating foods that were likely partially rotting continually just because we didn't have great ways of storing food. And in fact, the advent of beer and other fermented foods quite often was from foods that had just been neglected for a long period of time and happened to spoil in the right way so that they were actually non-harmful and still edible and probably eventually beneficial in our evolutionary history. If you go to an apple that's on the shelf in the store, there's probably very few microbes there just because, sanitation is so important in the kind of grocery chain. And again, to put it in perspective, we have on the order of 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 10th. So, on the order of like 1 billion to 10 billion organisms per gram of contents in our colon. And when you go to a yogurt, even where there's known loads of microbes, it's like 10 to the 8th. So on the order of kind of 100 million microbes per gram. So even in fermented foods, the load of microbes is way less than what you'd find in the digestive tract. So as soon as you have a scoop of yogurt, those microbes are going to be vastly outnumbered by the microbes that already inhabit your digestive tract. And as soon as you go to a non-fermented food like an apple, it's going to be just a drop in the bucket. It doesn't mean it can't have a biological role, but it's probably not really that big of a signal.
So more fermented foods. I know that you have some good tips because not all fermented foods are sort of created equal. I've heard you talk about fridge versus shelf. Also, sometimes I think it can be easy here to get confused with pickled foods that are not actually fermented. Can you kind of give us a bit of your top line tips for choosing fermented foods that are likely to have this favorable effect on our inflammatory markers and immune system?
Yeah, I mean, the whole fermented food thing is kind of confusing, especially for, Americans. We don't, other than yogurt, it's not something that is like a common part of the average American diet. So one way that you can tell if something is fermented is most fermented foods will have, at least in the United States, a symbol that says live and active cultures on it. And so that's to designate that there are living microbes within that food item. And because there's living organisms in that food item, in general, these food items are kept in the refrigerated section. So as soon as you see like shelf-stable pickles, like something in the non-refrigerated section, chances are it doesn't have live and active microbes in it because it's been processed to be shelf-stable. Within the shelf-stable, there are things that were fermented and then sterilized so that they could be shelf-stable. And the jury's out as to whether those may have some benefits. There are no living microbes in there, but the microbes have, fermented that food. And so there are chemicals that the microbes have produced that are within that food that may have some benefit. But chances are it's probably not as beneficial as if you had the molecules and the actual live microbes as well. And then there's the whole shelf-stable food that looks like pickles, for example, but it's just cucumbers that have been brined in vinegar. And in that case, there's never been microbes that have touched those food. And so those are not fermented foods at all. So, looking for that live and active culture label, looking in the refrigerated section is a good place to start to ensure that you're getting actual fermented food.
And quite often I get asked about sodium, and I think it's a good reminder that not all fermented foods are high in sodium. Some of the yogurts and kombucha are not as high in sodium as kraut. So there is ways to kind of go about getting a good amount of fermented foods into your diet without having crazy amounts of sodium. I've got this kind of vision in my mind here, and I want you to tell me if you think this is possible for the future. But I kind of imagine this future where you can understand the microbiome signature of a particular population, like Americans or Canadians or Australians, and get an idea as to what microbes maybe at a population level people are missing. And then similar to iodine, how we fortified that through the food chain, introduce these microbes into fermented foods throughout the food chain so people are just naturally getting exposure.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that a lot of people have talked about. But one thing to understand is that, the microbiome is this complex community. There's over 100 different species that live within our gut. And so trying to introduce one or two or a handful of different species in there is not as easy as just like, I'm going to swallow this specific microbe that I know is good for me, and it's going to somehow magically take up residence. It's kind of like, if you've ever done gardening, if you're, living in a desert and you try to put in like a fern, it's just not going to do well. And so it could be that in order to get these microbes, these sort of what we would think would be beneficial microbes that could help populations into their gut, might require a whole bunch of effort to sort of dampen the immune system so that it doesn't reject this new microbe that it's never seen before, or provide it specific carbohydrates that we know that microbe really likes to eat, and create a niche within the gut so that microbe can take up residence and become a part of the community. It could be that doing that is just way too complicated. And if we can identify the molecules that these beneficial microbes are creating, maybe we just take those molecules. And if we're just constantly consuming those, that might be a way around trying to totally re-engineer a microbiome that might be in a really bad shape and may take a lot of effort on multiple fronts to get it to a better community.
And just to, I totally agree with all that. And I think the vision you articulated would be a wonderful one, where we could just kind of have this, distributed network of healthy microbes that people could access and fortify their guts. A couple things associated with that. One is the microbes that are in the fermented foods are typically adapted to those fermented foods, and those microbes actually typically don't do well in the gut environment. And so you would need to, take fermented foods that have all the fermented food associated microbes and then spike into that gut bacteria that hopefully would survive long enough on the shelf to where when people ate them, they could colonize. So it would need to be like and then you're crossing into this realm of, just the practical side of it. There's a bunch of companies right now that are really interested in this concept of microbiome reprogramming, and how can we develop cocktails of microbes that can either help fight C. difficile or help individuals that are going into immunotherapy, or these different kind of clinical indications. And certainly an extension of that is, how do we take people that are healthy and make them even healthier and make them live longer lives without disease? And most of those companies right now are taking the route of drug development, where they actually develop a cocktail of microbes and then they study them in phase 1, phase 2 trials. They would be prescribed for a given indication. And so I really love the idea of a set of microbes that could instill health, that would be in food and widely available. But the reality is that most of the microbes from our gut that we would want to introduce probably would need to go through some sort of drug development pipeline before they could be distributed to people, because most of these bacteria don't have this, what is generally recognized as safe categorization, which most probiotics have, but gut bacteria do not have.
Interested to get your thoughts on something that I've been seeing a lot of online. And I think it feeds into this idea that some people may have more disrupted, damaged microbiomes than others. And Erica, you mentioned there, eating a fiber-rich diet is great to feed these and encourage them to thrive, proliferate, thrive, and produce these compounds that we benefit from. But I have seen a number of people with chronic inflammatory type conditions, autoimmune conditions, allergy type conditions, turning to an all meat, no fiber, or pretty much very, very low fiber diet. And this is, I guess, on paper, it's similar to a kind of low FODMAP diet in principle, in that it's an elimination type of diet. And I understand why people are doing this, because anecdotally, there's enough people to suggest they are getting a reprieve from their symptoms. They feel better, which is what we all want for people. I'm just not sure whether it's the best dietary pattern for the microbiome and for someone's health in the long term. But I'd love to kind of hear from you. Do you think that there are people out there who are just missing microbes and are unable to bring these high fiber foods into their diet without revving up their inflammation? And do you think we need more solutions and tools to be able to help those people get to a sort of microbiome composition where they can handle these foods that everyone is telling them are healthy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think, there are individuals where, things have really gone south and they have a lot of inflammation in their gut. And as soon as you eat a high fiber diet, you're, resulting in more microbes, right? More growth of microbes, more fermentation products. And that can, on top of an inflamed colon, really exacerbate symptoms. And so these low FODMAP diets are a great tool for some of these individuals to reduce their symptoms and give them symptomatic relief. The key in these individuals is, what's the off-ramp for that? You don't want, someone on a no fiber diet for 30, 40 years. That doesn't seem to be, the path to good health. So how you get individuals to improve their symptoms so that there can be a slow reintroduction either of microbes or fiber or some combination of both maybe, and slowly repair the intestinal lining and the inflammation and get the microbiota diversity and fermentation that we know is beneficial. And unfortunately, that is just going to be a lot of clinical trials and research, and maybe different for different groups of people, how you get them back to a healthy diet. But I think that's right. And a lot of people, have emailed us and said, I have IBD or whatever, and I want to eat a high fiber diet, but I can't, deal with the pain associated with it, and just figuring out ways to get an off ramp of that onto a better diet is something that's going to be very complicated.
Yeah, I think it's a frustrating position. It must be for someone, right? Because, most of the world is talking about the benefits of eating more healthy plants, and to be in that position where you want to, but your body's just not allowing you to, that's not a fun kind of position to find yourself in. So I really feel for anyone that's there. Do you think your study on fiber and fermented food, do you think on the fiber arm that it was sort of differences in the microbiome composition that explained the sort of variance in the response that you saw?
I think it appears to be so and just to go back to your comment about, feeling for these people that are unable to process fiber, because that does lead in nicely to this question. I think, kind of a dirty little secret in the field of microbiome science is that, we were talking about how, introduction of microbes that might be beneficial, but we don't have, could be tricky through kind of official routes. We are continually cycling other people's fecal microbes through our own digestive tract. I mean, it's just a fact of kind of fecal matter being everywhere at a low level. And so we're continually doing a low-grade fecal transplant on ourselves. And I think that the question is, when you get a microbe from the outside that might be beneficial, how do you keep that microbe as a resident rather than just passing through your digestive tract and leaving? And one way of keeping microbes in your digestive tract and having them set up shop and take up permanent residence is by creating niches for them, creating professions for them to make their living. And that really is eating a diet of diverse fibers. Now, I understand if the fiber degraders aren't there, how do you do that? And so I think, I would encourage people that are having these sorts of problems to try to find that sweet spot of where you can have a little bit of fiber in your diet and keep it there for a long period of time, months, maybe years. And over that period of time, the hope is that you'll gradually accrue these microbes. They'll stick as they experience that, and you'll gradually be able to ramp up your fiber degradation over time. You just have to be patient and hope to encourage these microbes that you randomly encounter in your life. So I don't think it's a hopeless situation. I just think it's one that you need to be diligent about, and you need to keep a little bit of fiber in your diet and try to increase that as possible to try to create the opportunities for the microbes when you do encounter them.
And even in our study, our fiber fermented study, these were healthy individuals, and they still did a slow ramp of increasing fiber and fermented food consumption, because we knew if they, went from 20 grams of fiber a day to 60, they would experience a lot of discomfort. But if you do it slowly over a period of weeks, or, you could even do it over a period of months, your microbiome is adaptable. That's the whole point of this facet of our biology that can adapt. It can, if you can do it in a way that you can manage the discomfort, it's not, making you feel terrible. You just kind of see yourself on this path of like, okay, today, this is what I can handle. And then in a couple weeks, I'm going to try adding a little bit more of this, and sort of get yourself on this road to increasing, fiber and fermented food consumption. And even in our healthy subjects, they needed to do that too, to feel okay as they were ramping up.
Which makes sense, but sometimes in practice, you can get a bit excited about changing your diet, and you can want to change 100 things at once. But do we have any idea as to how different our microbiome is from one another?
Yeah. It definitely is individualized. So, I mean, that's the kind of major backdrop here, is that your gut microbiome is a fingerprint. It does change over the course of your lifestyle, or over the course of your life. And if you take antibiotics or something like that, it can change pretty drastically over a short period of time. But generally, if I see a profile of Simon's microbiota today, 3 months from now, if I'm given 20 different microbiome profiles, I'll be able to tell which one is yours. And so there are these, species that are, and strains that will be indicators of your microbiome. Your microbiome will have similarities to people you live with, to people you've lived with in the past, to potentially your mother over the course of your lifetime, certainly siblings. Identical twins is kind of the closest you can get if you've been raised together. But there are still, massive differences between identical twins. So there's a huge factor that just kind of environment and random things in your life, maybe differences in nuances in the diet, that can change your microbiome. Now, if you take two people that live in completely different parts of the world or live completely different lifestyles, I mean, the differences are going to make differences between two people living in the same city look like they're basically the same person. I mean, they're just, as soon as you compare a Hadza hunter-gatherer to an American, it's like, worlds apart. So it really depends on the two people you're talking about. But I did want to circle back to this question of the fiber in the fiber study, because it was, we got these healthy adults that have different microbiomes, but it did appear that the people with the most diverse microbiomes entering the trial did the best on that high fiber diet, and the people with the lowest diversity microbiomes, it appears that they may have had a more inflammatory response to the fiber. And so it really seems like they're even in a group of people where their microbiomes look generally industrialized, very similar to one another. There are these nuances where a certain subset of those people may be better prepared for dealing with a high fiber diet should they want to implement it over a short period of time.
Yeah, I think this is a really good reminder for anyone listening that perhaps works, as a dietitian or a nutritionist with people, and most people are fully aware of this, but there really isn't a one size fits all prescription that's going to be a success for everyone. And you've explained these beautiful characteristics of what a healthy diet is, but how to get there might look a little different for individuals. I'm curious as to if someone's listening and thinking, gosh, this is so interesting. I want to look through a window and see my microbiome. I want to understand the weak points, the strong points. Am I better suited to apples or eggplant or lettuce? Are we there yet? I know that there are various testing kits that are advertised. Do we have the data and the information to be able to tell people that?
It's a moment where there are a lot of companies that are trying this, and we haven't tried them all or validated their methods. I will say that there's one very kind of scientifically rigorous, well-accepted group that's doing this for predicting spikes in blood sugar after a meal, so postprandial glycemic index. And there's a group out of the Weizmann Institute that has created a machine learning algorithm for using microbiome profile to predict how somebody will respond in a personalized way to a given food, whether, a banana will spike your blood sugar as opposed to me. And there may be a difference that can be inferred based on our microbiome profile. So that group is doing this very well. It's very scientifically rigorous. There are other groups that are kind of following in their footsteps or creating their own methods. A lot of those are kind of a little bit more immature in terms of at least people from the outside being able, like us who aren't part of the companies, to be able to assess how good they are. But certainly, if you can find what looks to be a reputable company with good scientific papers that they've, posted on their website that they've taken part in, just getting a profile of your microbiome is a very interesting thing to do, because if eventually, for instance, your health changes or some life event happens, to have that baseline profile may be useful down the road. In terms of the recommendations that come along with a lot of these profiles, it's very early days for those having actual validity for what you should be eating and how it will affect your health.
If you want a very cheap and easy way to sort of keep tabs on your microbiome, you can just, pay attention to your bowel movements. Those are an indication of how everything's functioning. If you have regular bowel movements fairly frequently, if you look up a Bristol stool chart, they'll show you, the different consistencies of bowel movements and where you want your stool to be, right? You don't want it to be super constipated. You don't want it too runny. That can be an indication as you're changing your diet, increasing fiber, increasing fermented food. If you see that now, instead of having a bowel movement every other day, you're having a bowel movement once a day, and that bowel movement is easier to pass, that's an indication that your microbiome and your GI system is functioning better. So that's, just the lo-fi way of paying attention to your microbiome.
I recently ran my full labs through Function Health, and I have to say the results were eye-opening. Turns out my ApoB was higher than ideal, probably thanks to a little too much coconut yogurt. I also found out I was slightly low in copper, something that I would have never suspected without testing. On the flip side, my biological age came back 13.3 years younger than my actual age, a calculation based on the work of aging researcher Dr. Morgan Levine. So all in all, I've got a few tweaks to make to optimize my lipids and nutrient status, but overall my blood work says I'm doing pretty well. That's what I love about Function. You get access to over 160 biomarkers covering everything from hormones and inflammation to nutrients, toxins, cardiovascular risk, and more. And all your results are housed in one beautiful platform, all tracked over time. Once you get your results, you can make informed changes before small issues become big ones. To get started, head to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. The first 1,000 people get a $100 credit toward their membership. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill.
Talk to me about the specific things that you found through your research that lead you to believe that quite a lot of our health outcome is modulated, affected by the composition of our microbiome.
It's a whole series of little pieces of information rather than one knockout blow. So I guess the first thing which we realized, even 10 years ago when we started looking at this with fairly crude microbiome analysis with what was called 16S analysis, where you just take one gene from all the microbes and you use that to work out what's going on, saw that in nearly every case where you said I've got 100 cases of a disease and you had 100 controls who were healthy, you always saw that there was less diversity in the case group. So for virtually any condition, the universal default position was that a disease group will have a less healthy looking gut microbiome than the controls. Even when you adjust for everything else, age and weight and sex and smoking and everything else you can think of, the disease seemed to have this effect. So there was this link between the microbes and disease. That didn't tell you about direction of causality, but it certainly said these are consistently associated in every single study. Then, of course, you've got all the animal studies where you could transfer the fecal samples to from one disease animal to a sort of healthy animal and make it diseased, which made you think that they were having a causal effect. Well, it wasn't in humans, but it was a very nice, you could take human microbiomes and use these animal models to shift weight or cause inflammation, or you could cause anxiety or depression in mice, suggesting that there was a causal relationship of what was going on in the microbes to all this. Then you had obviously the successes of fecal transplants in humans, which haven't quite gone at the pace we thought they were going to go 10 years ago, but still there are a few successes. And I would say, the fact that you can get remission in something like ulcerative colitis in 1 in 5 cases by getting a donor sample put into someone with a colitis case and effectively curing that person. It doesn't work in 4 out of 5, but it does work in 1 out of 5. All these stories are telling you that the microbiome is playing a key role in health. And as we drill down into the individual microbes and we work out that they have properties like anti-inflammatory properties, that they're also, they can interfere with the medications you're taking and so make them effective or ineffective, shows that they are really playing a really active part in our health. And by changing them, you can also change your health. So I think it's an increasing list of studies that are being ticked off showing how the microbiome, and particularly the chemicals they produce, are key for our health, because we know from many other work that some of the chemicals they do produce, like, for example, serotonin in the brain, is a really healthy chemical. So the idea they are these pharmacies is growing. So I think we also know that from our work that the microbiome plays a role in how you respond to food, and that it plays a role in these inflammatory sugar spikes, or how quickly you get rid of fat in your body. And, what we thought was only produced by the liver, these bile salts, is now also produced by your gut microbes. So really, they've become a key organ in our bodies that we had no idea about, really, even 10 years ago. Suddenly, they are coming into every part of our this whole health. So, yeah, it's a very long answer to a very short question, but I think it's a whole series of small bits of evidence that are accumulating to show why they are crucial factors in our health, and importantly, unlike most of the other organs in our body, much easier for us to manipulate and to modify if we can understand it.
So I want to go into some of the work that you're doing with Zoe and how you're investigating this to better understand it. I've had Dr. Will Bolsowitz on the show a few times, and the Sonnenberg. So we have spoken about the microbiome, but if someone's kind of catching this episode and hasn't listened to those, I mean, I do suggest they go back and listen to those. But at a sort of high level here, how does food actually interact with the microbiome? I think that's an important point for us to kind of just go over. And why might people respond differently to different foods based on their microbiome composition?
So at a high level, when you eat food, depending on the type of food, it may or may not reach your gut microbiome, is one thing to realize. So cheap, highly refined, ultra-processed food, or you're just having a sugary drink, for example, may go straight into the small intestine and the sugar gets absorbed into your bloodstream with very little interaction with your gut microbiome. We don't know that's absolutely true, but that's what we think. Other food that might be healthier, that contains, say, plants with high in fiber, will get further down into the gut, into the lower intestine, that's where most of the microbes are. That's where they interact with it. And there will be several components of the food that will interact. And one of the key parts is the amount of fiber. Fiber is basically there, so it will be protected until it reaches the lower part of the intestine. And that's where the microbes will attack it and break it down into its constituent parts and extract all the nutrients and create these other great chemicals on the way. And they also extract from the plant something called polyphenols, which is the other important thing that we've only really recently realized, that are like rocket fuel for your gut microbes. So we can't process polyphenols directly, but our microbes can. And by using the fiber and the polyphenols, our microbes are then sort of energized to produce all kinds of chemicals, vitamins, everything else to control the rest of our body, control our immune system, etc. So that's the essential way. Then also you've got, you can break down sugars. The microbes break down fats for us. They're fat-eating microbes, just as there are fiber-eating microbes, and they break it down into these smaller components, these small fatty acids that get used, and protein as well. So in a way, we have a whole niche of little animals in there that are taking all the components, all the different foods, and the greater the variety of the food you're eating, the more this colony of little microbial will be, and the greater diversity of the chemicals you produce. That's my vision of this. And I think we're gaining more knowledge about how, each week, about how important the microbe processes are, the enzymes they produce are in breaking down that food and really doing it efficiently so that there's no waste and we're not hanging around lots of blobs of fat in our bloodstream, or we're getting excess sugar that's causing all kinds of stress to our body, and there's not so much inflammation. It's all dampened down. So all this depends on our microbes really functioning really well all the time.
Yeah, I don't often hear many people talking about protein and fats and the interaction between those and our gut bugs. And I saw a paper the other day. I haven't dug into it in detail, but it was looking at omega-3, DHA, and EPA, and I was surprised to see that they seem to find that they DHA and EPA, some of the fats at least, made their way down to the large intestine and had a prebiotic effect. So it'd be kind of interesting to watch that space of research as it evolves. The other half of my question, Tim, was what about our microbiome may dictate the types of food that we feel best on, that leave us feeling energized, vital, and that positively affect biomarkers of disease?
Yeah, well, it's a tricky question. So, in a way, one is, cause or effect. And I think we've got to realize there's a two-way process between the microbes and our food and our brain. Obviously, if you've got the right set of microbes, then you're going to be able to get rid of foods, digest them much more easily. I think that's the... So if you've got fat-busting microbes, then actually you'll be able to deal with fat pretty well. But if you don't, they might leave you bloated and having problems. But of course, the more fat you eat, then you will start to gain fat-busting microbes. In the same way that if you don't eat plants, and then you're lacking all of those fiber breaking down products. So I think there's a sense of you can build up these microbes over time that then you get adjusted to it. But if you are really changing your diet in a big way, then you could be in for a shock for a while until your body is used to it. We do know you can acquire microbes as you go along, and I think you've talked before on podcast about the seaweed story and how people can gain microbes. You're not just fixed in the amount of microbes you have. You can, just by eating lots of sushi, suddenly acquire the ability to break down some of these tougher plants, etc. So I think it's a two-way process. But so some people may have trouble eating foods because they don't have the right microbes that break them down. They then send different signals to the brain, which might say, this is difficult for me. And we do know from animal work, not human work, that microbes can send out signals to actually choose the foods for you. Mm-hmm. So, which sort of makes sense in an evolutionary way. If you think you've got the microbes that are all struggling to survive, and you've got this little microbe only likes eating burgers, if there's a way he can evolve a signal to send to your brain to say, send me more burgers down, otherwise I'm going to die, you would do it. And we do know that in tiny little insects, just by manipulating the microbes, they can send signals out to say, eat more protein or eat more carbs. And so we know in theory it's true. But I think it's this, we definitely are a mix of our microbes. And because we're all unique, all of us have a unique set of microbes, we are going to be getting different signals, and we'll all, in a way, be able to digest food slightly differently because of that. So again, it goes back to this idea of our uniqueness and the fact we the standard diet isn't going to have the same effect on all of us.
With regards to those signals, I've always wondered this. Do you think, I know that approximately 50% of the average person's calories today are coming from ultra-processed foods. do you think the consumption of those foods could be changing the microbiome in a way that then it's this kind of positive cycle where the microbiome is sending signals for more of that food because there are certain bacteria in there that are thriving off that?
I definitely do, yes. I mean, I think it's going to be quite hard to prove in humans, and that's why we may have to rely on animal studies to do that. Mm-hmm. But it sort of makes sense. Particularly, you see people who are on junk food diets or animals on junk food diet, they have a very pro-inflammatory set of gut microbes. So these are microbes that like an inflammatory environment. They thrive off it. And that allows them a niche because the ones that don't like it are wiped out, basically. Mm-hmm. So these guys have the place to themselves. They like it a bit hotter, if you like, than everyone else. And so it's in their interest to keep it hot, to keep the other guys away so they can dominate. And I think that's the way to look at it. So I think it's perfectly plausible that, our microbes are producing these signals to our brain to keep this whole process going. And that's why it may be difficult for some people to break this cycle or this junk food cycle, that our microbes are contributing to it as well as other bits in our brain.
I'm sure you've heard of Gymshark. It is one of the biggest fitness brands in the world today. And it all started in a teenager's garage. Yep, that's right. Ben Francis was 19 years old, printing shirts himself, and he built it all on Shopify. That's what I love most about Shopify. It gives everyday people the tools to turn an idea into something real. And if you align it with something that you believe adds value to the world, it won't feel like work at all. And I can tell you, honestly, that's exactly how I feel about building 38 Terra with Dr. Will Bolsewitz, bringing a truly science-backed gut health product to life. Whether you're starting a supplement line, a sustainable clothing brand, or any kind of physical goods business, Shopify gives you everything you need. Beautiful storefronts, secure payments, and AI tools to help write product descriptions and generate discount codes. And their 24/7 support is actually very helpful. Shopify powers millions, and I mean millions, of businesses worldwide, including 38 Terras. If you've got a dream, allow Shopify to help bring it to life. Start your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/proof. That's shopify.com/proof. Take us inside the gut. Let's create a scenario here where we're talking about a person with a healthy microbiome, right? And they have great diversity, but they develop an infection. And I think before you said that when you develop the infection, you'll be in a state of dysbiosis.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. They take their course of antibiotics. What's happening to that person's microbiome during that phase?
Well, there are three main things that happen within the microbiome when you take antibiotics. One, a loss of diversity. Two, you are causing widespread damage to the species. And three, you are choosing or selecting the resistant microbes. And so effectively, if you think about, we were just talking about dysbiosis a moment ago, and then the next question was, what happens when you take antibiotics? And after describing them, basically what I've just described is you are medically inducing dysbiosis. And with the exception of adding the antibiotic resistance element.
Are the antibiotics, are they eradicating species? Like, are we actually losing? I think you said some studies show you may only have 50 species, but then there's other reviews and whatnot that'll say 300 to 1,000. So the jury's a little bit out there. But when we take whatever the number is that we take antibiotics, are we losing species, or are we kind of just like dimming the light and losing the total number of the good guys that exist in the gut, but we still have the
species that we had before we were taking the antibiotics?
Well, the term that we use for species when we're looking at these things is richness. Richness is the term for a number of different species, which is a little bit different than diversity, by the way. Diversity also takes into account the presence of different species. So like, for example, we wouldn't call it diverse if we had 300 of one species and, one of like 5 other species, right? Like that's just, but anyway, so with this, when we look at richness, which is the number of different species, we see that when you take antibiotics, you are definitely reducing the richness. Now, the question is, will they come back? Because if they do come back, then it's more akin to what you're describing of dimming the lights. And if you look at the research, it is clear the gut does eventually recover. We do get the species back.
How long does that take usually?
This is the $1 million question. And that brings me to, it feels like this is a good time for us to talk about a new study that came out about a year ago in the journal Cell, which we've talked about on this show before. Cell is one of the most prestigious medical journals out there. And in this study, Simon, they took a group of 20 people. Now, let me say, these people did not have infections. And the reason why they chose to study healthy people is because if you, as we were discussing a moment ago, if a person has an infection, like their microbiome is already disrupted. So let's start with a healthy microbiome that has not been disrupted and see what the effect of these antibiotics are. And so they gave 4 different types of antibiotics to these people, and they watched to see what happens. Now, our response to these antibiotics is very individualized. So you can't say that because you took this antibiotic, this is exactly how long your microbiome is going to be knocked down, and this is when you will recover. For the majority of the people in this study, and by the way, it was only 5 days of antibiotics, only 5 days, whereas like many antibiotics people take for 10 or 14 days, and in some cases, people are taking for even more than 14 days. In this study, the vast majority of people recovered their microbiome by 2 months.
Okay. And were they adopting any specific protocols? I know we're going to talk
for
about
recovery. No, they did not. But there were people that were in this study that wished that they had specific protocols because there were some bad things that took place. So there was again, these are healthy people. They showed up and they participated in a study, and we're grateful that they did this.
Do you know what kind of antibiotics they were taking?
Yeah, these were mostly antibiotics that were given for pneumonia. So there was basically like a series of 4 different antibiotics that were like typical sort of pneumonia style antibiotics. So like an example would be levofloxacin. Levofloxacin is one of the examples. So we call that Levaquin in the United States. So anyway, there were 3 people that had a completely different response to the antibiotics. And it's actually quite disturbing what happened to these 3 people. They lost diversity, they continued to lose diversity, and they did not recover their microbiome for 6 months. And in that process, their microbiome, and the authors, by the way, literally say what I'm about to say. This is not me just being hyperbolic. This is like the exact language they used in the paper. Their microbiome resembled what you would find in a person who is sick, like extremely sick, critically ill in the intensive care unit. So we don't know exactly why that happened to those particular people.
Did they look at what these people were eating?
They did not look at what these people were eating, but they did look at their diversity. And again, this is a very small study. One of the challenges that we have when we get into this space of discussing antibiotics and what happens after antibiotics is that we need more data.
Yeah, I was just thinking then, like, are we assuming that antibiotics across the board all have the same effect? Because there are so many, right?
No, they don't. They have different effects. But I think what they're showing in this study, though, is that like here are these different antibiotics that you could use to treat pneumonia. Again, pneumonia, if you don't take an antibiotic, can be a life-threatening condition. So you need the antibiotics. And with these, in this case, here are these 3 people who have a very, very different response that appears to be like kind of disturbing in terms of how this all played out. And what they found for these 3 people is if you look at the starting diversity within their microbiome, again, this is a small number. We need more data, but if you look at their starting diversity was significantly less than the other people.
That's interesting. That reminds me of the people in the Sonnenberg's Fibre fermented food study with the folks who didn't do so well on the fiber diet.
Yeah, they had low diversity because with the low diversity, they were struggling to ramp up their fiber. We could talk. That's a whole other study.
But that makes me think about this whole discussion of how do antibiotics affect the microbiome. It seems like your starting point's really important. So if you're someone who is healthy and has a rich microbiome, it may be that the effect of that antibiotic is different to, say, someone with IBS or a condition like SIBO who already has some disruption to the microbiome.
I think that there's points of vulnerability that exist with specific people. And, one of the ways that we know this, Simon, is that there's a common infection called Clostridioides difficile. It's extremely dangerous. Unchecked, untreated, this infection can clearly be life-threatening. And I've had patients, granted years ago, but I've had patients who had to have their colon removed because this infection was so out of control.
So when you say unchecked, untreated, someone could have that and not have any symptoms?
No, they would typically have diarrhea. But some people, what they'll do when they have diarrhea is, like, for example, they think that it's just a bug, a tummy bug, like a virus, and they'll take Imodium. And so Imodium is loperamide, which is taken to basically slow down diarrhea, slow down bowel motility. And in the process of doing this, their intentions are good, but unfortunately it's not a good choice, because what ends up happening is your body is actually trying to evacuate this toxin that comes from the bacteria, and you are now trapping the toxin inside your colon, which leads to something called toxic megacolon. And that's how people end up either in a life-threatening, compromised position, or potentially getting their colon removed as a result of this infection. So, but the point with the infection, though, is that this is one of the clear-cut, undeniable, every single doctor in the United States, if they're like a decent doctor, is going to acknowledge that this is a very real risk with antibiotics, is that you could develop this infection after antibiotics. And if you take a look and see who are the people that are most at risk, who are the people who are most at risk from developing this infection? The people who are most at risk are the people who have inflammatory bowel disease. And these are the people that have the deepest dysbiosis at baseline.
So there's a vulnerability there.
So I think that there's a vulnerability there where if you already have a damaged dysbiotic gut, then there is a higher risk of having complications as a result of your antibiotics.
Okay. So far we've kind of described this dimming of the light, this loss of diversity. I think my question earlier was a bit convoluted, but I was trying to decipher if it was a dimming of the light or if we were knocking out species.
Can I add something real quick since you're bringing that up? There was one study where they took people and they put them on a triple antibiotic. So I mean, this was not the 5 days of pneumonia treatment. This was like a triple hardcore IV antibiotic. Those people lost species and they never came back. So it is possible. I don't want to say like it's all dimming the lights, but I think in the vast majority of antibiotic cases, it is dimming the lights.
You quickly reeled off prebiotics before, but perhaps you can remind us from a definition point of view, what does prebiotic mean? And as an umbrella term, like what does it actually encompass?
Prebiotics are this exciting thing that you and I have been talking about for 5 years now, but I think that the market is starting to catch up on the concept that you and I introduced in episode 17. And so prebiotics, basically, if I were to use it in layman's terms, it's food for your microbiome. If you're talking about it from a scientific perspective, it's some sort of substrate, which basically means some sort of compound that you are introducing to the gut that the microbes will then consume or metabolize. And in the process of doing that, they will, number one, microbes will grow stronger. So there is a change within the microbiome as a result of prebiotics. And number two, you actually will get health benefits as a result of it. So in order for something to qualify as a prebiotic, it has to impact your gut microbes and it has to impact your health in a beneficial way. You need those two things.
Mm-hmm. And so we're getting those when we're eating a diversity of plants. How do you feel about prebiotic supplements? Because that's a big category now. And if someone's in the kind of grocery store or supplement store, they're faced with a lot of different options. So do you have any advice or do you recommend a prebiotic supplement in this context of taking a course of antibiotics? And how could someone kind of navigate that to choose one that's going to be most beneficial?
I have had great experience with the use of prebiotic fiber supplements within this context, and also with people who have other digestive health issues, such as irritable bowel syndrome, whether it be constipation or diarrhea predominant. I've had great success using prebiotic fiber supplements in that space. Now, let's drill down on what to look for in a prebiotic, what you want. What you don't want is something that, well, first of all, it has to be prebiotic, right? So not all forms of fiber actually are prebiotic. So it needs to be demonstrated in a study to actually impact the microbiome and to have health benefits. So it has to be prebiotic. Number two, taking massive doses of a monofiber is not the approach for winning. Because again, and I mentioned this a moment ago, the evidence suggests that there's a certain amount of benefit that you will get once you cross a threshold. And then it's time to move on to something else, because you're not going to get more benefits from hammering and pounding the exact same thing more. You just, more does not translate into more in this case. You get what you get. It's time to move on. So I don't recommend that people like pound monofibers and take, 10, 15 grams of whatever it may be.
When you say pound a monofiber, are we talking like a straight up inulin or something?
Yeah, exactly. And the issue, and I think inulin is bringing up a good point, because inulin is prebiotic, but the issue is inulin also is extremely gas producing. That's because inulin is literally the definition of a fructan, which is a FODMAP. So one of the things that you can do if you want to be smart about this is think about the fact that you literally are in a state of dysbiosis. Again, you have medically induced a dysbiosis. We want to restore eubiosis. But when you have a damaged gut, you are far more likely to suffer symptoms as a result of adding fiber to your diet. So the way that we can approach this, Simon, is to choose low FODMAP forms of prebiotics. Low FODMAP forms of prebiotics are ultimately going to achieve the effect that we're looking for, support the microbes, give us the health benefits, restore the gut barrier. This is what we want, but the difference being that you don't have to feel miserable and gassy and bloated and all of those things because you just added this prebiotic supplement.
Right. So how does someone navigate that? Do they need to understand which ingredients are low FODMAP and not, or are they looking for low FODMAP? It would be clearly called out on the label. It's
not necessarily likely to be clearly called out. Part of this is understanding the individual types of fiber that exist and which ones are high FODMAP versus low FODMAP. I mentioned that inulin is high FODMAP. Acacia powder or partially hydrolyzed guar gum are examples of fibers that are low FODMAP. Those are options. Okay, now the issue here is, again, those are monofibers. It's just one form of fiber. If we want something better, we want a blend. We want a mix. We want to be hitting multiple thresholds. And we also shouldn't just think about fiber, because fiber isn't the only prebiotic. There are different types of prebiotics. Resistant starches are prebiotics. Polyphenols are prebiotics. The way that this works is when you eat a meal, most of what you consume is digested and absorbed and broken down in your small intestine. But there are these parts that will arrive into your colon intact the same way that they were when you entered your stomach. And these are the prebiotics. Fiber, resistant starches, and polyphenols. Each of them, in their own unique way, has the ability to impact your microbiome, to support the beneficial gut bugs, and to achieve health benefits for you. In the last episode that I was on, I mentioned that I'm starting a supplement company. And the intent of that supplement company, called 38 Terra, is to take gut health supplements to a level that's never been seen before.
Which stands for 38 trillion.
38 Terra stands for 38 trillion. Because we have 38 trillion microbes, and this company, we are focused on the gut. We believe that health benefits come from supporting and nurturing the gut, whether you are sick or not sick, or you just took antibiotics. I believe that the key in this case is to support the gut, because when you do that, there are downstream benefits throughout the entire body. So we're talking about like, what is the preferable prebiotic supplement? And I mentioned, like, we want to get as many different microbes as possible, and we want different types of prebiotics: fiber, resistant starch, and polyphenols. And that is exactly what our first product, called Daily Microbiome Nutrition, is. It wasn't developed specifically for the purpose of being used after antibiotics. It was developed to support a person who has a damaged gut and allow them to restore their gut. It was also developed for the person who does not currently have gut issues and wants to continue to have a healthy gut and wants to support and elevate their gut microbes as much as possible. But when you think about like what we're looking for after antibiotics, this checks all the boxes, because we have 7 different unique plants. We have all 3 forms of prebiotics being represented: fiber, resistant starches, and polyphenols, that give you exactly what you're looking for. And by the way, the fiber that was selected and used in this product, Daily Microbiome Nutrition, again, like, this was developed with people with gut issues in mind, but it's for everyone.
Wow.
And these fibers are low FODMAP. So you don't need to worry about that issue.
I'm looking forward to getting my hands on that, swapping out that one that I showed you before.
Well, the cool thing about it is that, like, we were talking about having a healthy gut before taking the antibiotics, during the antibiotics, after the antibiotics. And that's this product is designed to help you to have a healthy gut, used on a daily basis to ensure that your gut bugs are getting the nutrition that they need.
Right. So you take that once a day.
You take that once a day. You take that once a day. Now, for some people may want to, I feel like this is a different conversation. There are some people that may want to amp that up to twice a day, but for the vast majority of people, once a day is all you need.
But people can go to 38terra.com if they want to read more about that.
38terra.com is where you can read more and check it out.
Okay. So polyphenols, resistant starch, prebiotic fiber, all in that one blend.
All in that one blend. 7 plants, 3 forms of prebiotics, 1 bioactive supplement that is so easily taken once a day. You literally just take a scoop, stir some water, and you drink it, and it tastes delicious.
Every time I hear resistant starch, I think about cooked and cooled potatoes, which I think you shared with us once in a previous episode, and green bananas.
Yeah, those are sort of the classic places that you can get resistant starch from. But what's interesting about the resistant starch that you'll find in this product specifically is that it's been clinically tested in humans, and we're using the dose that was used in the clinical trial, which is, I think, a unique thing when it comes to supplements. Many supplements will make claims without actually using the effective dose that was demonstrated in a randomized controlled trial to actually achieve the effect. And so, like, this is just one of the ingredients within Daily Microbiome Nutrition. But with the resistant starch from the potatoes, you're getting resistant starch type 2. And what they found in this human clinical trial is that over the course of 4 weeks, people are increasing 2 specific types of bacteria that basically every single one of us, we want more of. One was Akkermansia. Akkermansia is associated with our metabolism and also our immune system. And they increased Akkermansia by 317% using this type of resistant starch for 4 weeks. Once a day at the dose that's in Daily Microbiome Nutrition. And they increased the bifidobacteria, which, by the way, bifidobacteria are the friendly bacteria that you find in many probiotics. And they are also the friendly bacteria that people grow when they breastfeed. But they're like beneficial throughout life. And they increased the bifidobacteria 350%. Again, it's the exact dose that you will find in this product.
I think there might be some people listening that are thinking, is this product something that kids can take and pregnant women take? I'm assuming this is just a food product based on food ingredients. So is it safe for everyone to take?
I see no reason that a child or a pregnant woman would not be able to take this product. It's dairy free. It's keto friendly. It's paleo. It's vegan. So, in all those set cases, it seems okay. I think that the one thing that I would say is, you should always, whether it's this product or something else, you should always talk to your doctor about it.
Yeah. Anytime you kind of add something to your regime.
Yeah.
So that's prebiotics. So if you take a few steps down the aisle, you may get to a fridge, and then there is probiotics and also some probiotics on shelf, ambient probiotics. You mentioned in one of our previous episodes an interesting study out of Israel looking at probiotics during or after an antibiotic course. Perhaps you can remind us of that.
Yeah. So study done, published in 2018, September 2018. I remember very explicitly that was September. And in the journal Cell, which again, this is one of the top medical journals on the planet. And they convincingly showed, because they basically broke people into three groups. Those who received probiotics after antibiotics, those who received a fecal transplant of their own microbiome from before the antibiotics, and then those who got neither of those two things and basically were just allowed to recover passively. Whatever happens, happens. So now in this study, these were healthy people, so they didn't have an infection. Again, that's the only sort of fair way to do this, because then that they're starting off from a baseline of health. And they all received the same antibiotics. These are antibiotics, Cipro and Flagyl, metronidazole, that are commonly used for gut infections. And the probiotic that they used for people who received the probiotic had 11 different strains. So it was just this one type of probiotic. Now here's what they found. The recovery of the microbiome after antibiotics was the fastest among those who received the fecal transplant. Basically, you gave them their own microbiome back and they were good. Now, the issue with this is that I am not aware of any sort of way for us, at least at this point, to store our poop in a fashion that we could give ourselves a fecal transplant if we have to take antibiotics in the future, right? This is an unpredictable thing. So it's not super helpful what they found with that right there. But the surprising part, the part that went against everything that conventional wisdom said, was that the people who took the probiotics actually had a slower recovery than those who took no probiotic or anything at all. They just passively let their microbiome bounce back. Now, this was a big surprise. And it changed the way that I approach this issue. And I do want to unpack it, if you'll allow me to, more in a moment. But before I go there, I think it's very important that I acknowledge some of the limitations of the study that was done. Because we need to see more data. So does it change some things for me? Yes, because this is the best information that I have at the moment. But this is not written in stone. Right, and let's be careful. Yeah. So how many people did they have in the probiotic group? They had 8. So if you were a parent and I said, well, I'm a pediatrician and I'm going to give your child this thing based upon a study of 8 people, would you be excited with me? You might be a little bit upset, right? This is the best data that we have, but it was only 8 people. We don't know that this is generalizable. Maybe there was something weird about these 8 people. Maybe 3 of them were outliers. You never know. That's definitely possible. The second thing is that it was only one type of probiotic. It happened to have 11 strains. That doesn't mean that more strains is necessarily a bad thing, but maybe it's a bad thing. Maybe too many strains is a bad thing. It also was bacteria. It was not a yeast. There are forms of yeast probiotics that are beneficial and very well studied and good for us. So maybe it would be different with a different probiotic. Maybe it would be different with a yeast probiotic. And then the third thing is this hasn't been reproduced anywhere else. Anytime we have research that they've only found it in one place, we got to be a little bit careful before we start running wild with it, because sometimes we find things at one medical center and who knows, I'm not trying to make accusations that they're making stuff up, but who knows what was going on in that lab that led to this result. We need to see the same thing reproduced in other places. So there are some limitations to this study. Now, how do we pull this together? What do we do with this information? Well, I think that it's important to understand that the outcome that they were using in this study, what they were looking at, was the recovery of the microbiome. How long does it take for the microbiome to recover? That is a different thing than the reason why many people actually take a probiotic. The reason why many people take a probiotic, Simon, is actually to protect themselves from diarrhea and to protect themselves from the infection that we were talking about earlier, the C. diff infection.
When you say protect themselves from diarrhea, some antibiotics can cause diarrhea.
Many antibiotics can cause diarrhea, and the evidence with probiotics is very clear. Now, some are better than others, but generally speaking, in a systematic review and meta-analysis, probiotics taking with and after antibiotics clearly reduce the risk of antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And there's also specific ones. One of them that I'm a fan of is called Saccharomyces boulardii. And Saccharomyces boulardii has been demonstrated to reduce the risk of antibiotic-associated diarrhea, but it's also been demonstrated to reduce the risk of developing the C. diff infection.
That's a yeast-based probiotic.
It's a yeast-based probiotic. It's a good yeast.
Mm-hmm.
So in people who you select a probiotic, the goal is different. The goal is to protect them from these specific things. That's not the same as gut recovery. So how do we deal with this? Okay, here's what we do. Let me just break this down and try to make it simple for people. If you are super young, like you're talking about your kid who's under 3, or you're super old, or you are high risk for complications because you have other issues that could be heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, etc., right? A vulnerable patient, or you have inflammatory bowel disease. These are all people that probably should be taking probiotics. And the other that I would say is if you've ever had a C. diff infection before, then you definitely should be considering probiotics.
And how would those people, before you move on, how would they choose a probiotic?
Well, you want something that's evidence-based. So there are a number of different choices that exist. The Saccharomyces boulardii that I mentioned is widely available. It's not under any patent, and so it's not very expensive, and it has actually highly compelling evidence to indicate that it works. So there are guidelines from the American College of Gastroenterology that actually recommend it.
And so on the front of a lot of these is like a CFU, colony forming units, I think that stands for. Is that important to look at?
It is important. And so the dose needs to be like, basically, as I was mentioning earlier with the DMN, the Daily Microbiome Nutrition Supplement, if we want something to work, you should be taking it at the dose that was demonstrated in the clinical studies. That's true of medications, and that's also true of supplements. And so in this case, with the Saccharomyces boulardii, the dose is 500 milligrams. So it's not necessarily represented with the CFUs in the case of Saccharomyces boulardii, but the dose is 500 milligrams is the dose that you want. So now, if you're not one of these people, young, old, tons of comorbidities, inflammatory bowel disease, or a history of C. diff infection, the chances are you probably don't need to take probiotics after antibiotics.
Okay, and in the instance that someone does feel compelled to take a probiotic, how long do they take it for?
Okay, so if you do end up taking a probiotic, we're no longer of the frame of mind, based upon what we know, that the probiotic is going to help you recover your microbiome. So we only want to take it for the purpose of protecting ourselves from antibiotic-associated diarrhea or this C. diff infection. So the way that we do this is we take it for the duration that you're on, like you literally start it while you're on the antibiotics. And you take it for the duration that you're on the antibiotics, and then I would continue it for about a week. And then after that, you just stop.
So would it be fair to say, it sounds like the conversation around gut health and diversity has changed a bit over the years. There was a lot of focus on probiotics, which clearly have their place for very specific things. But would it be fair to say now the emphasis really is on prebiotics and the importance of prebiotics for building diversity?
Well, here's what we know. I have not seen a study where taking a probiotic has the impact on gut diversity that you can accomplish through dietary strategies. So, and dietary strategies, really what you're talking about are the prebiotics.
I've had a bunch of friends ask me recently, Simon, do you actually rate 8 Sleep? So here's the truth. I would not promote 8 Sleep if it hadn't genuinely helped me. It has literally transformed my sleep. Since adding the Pod 4 Ultra and then more recently the Pod 5 Ultra to my bed, I've been waking up feeling fresh, clear-headed, less inflamed in the face and fingers, and ready to take on the day with enthusiasm, rigor, kindness, and patience, all good things. That's what a proper night of recovery does. It literally makes me a better human. The Pod 5 isn't a mattress. It's a high-tech cover that fits over your existing bed. It personalizes the temperature on each side, tracks your sleep stages, and even detects snoring, gently adjusting your position to help stop it. And now with the new Pod Blanket, that same intelligent temperature control extends across your entire body. It's like sleeping in a cocoon that actively helps you recover. This is hands down one of the best investments I've ever made for my health. Head to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF to get $350 off your Pod 5 Ultra. And you've got 30 days to try it. And if you don't like it, which I can't see happening, send it back for a full refund. Shipping to many countries worldwide. See details at 8sleep.com/theproof.
What do we understand today about what constitutes a healthy microbiome?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. We still don't know what a healthy microbiome is. And yet it's very easy for us to make claims about what's unhealthy, even as scientists, in diseases and things like that. What we have done, I think, to get around that is we use each person as their own control. So where they started from and where they've moved to given a certain intervention or observation over time. It's really hard to do cross-sectional studies across populations and make conclusions about what's healthy because everyone is so different in terms of their microbiome. So we know what pathogens are. We know that there's C. diff, and we know there's certain bacteria that consistently are involved in disease processes. And if you have an overabundance of them, that may not be a good thing. But in some people, it's completely normal. So it's really hard to tell. But there are, generally we know that we have firmicutes and bacteroides, and those are the main populations, and that that will make up, it's almost like a 50-50 mix, let's say, of those two, and then everything else is sort of smaller populations. And you kind of want to see certain consistencies in your microbiome, but that's such a crude description that if, again, you zoom in, you'll see little blips that could cause alarm in one person and be totally normal in another. So I don't have a good answer for you.
Makes it hard to do microbiome testing then. Yeah. And give someone some sort of information they can do anything with.
Yeah, I talk a lot on this topic. Yeah, because it's a tough one. There's so many at-home microbiome tests these days. And I don't think we should stop making these tests or innovating on these tests. I think there's a future for them. It's just, I just gave a whole lecture on this a couple weeks ago, but and I won't go into much of the details, but there's not very much transparency.
Is that available online or anything?
No, it's not available online. But I gave a talk at an integrative health
meeting. Well, you can give us
the
synopsis.
Yeah, it's mainly that, okay, if you were to take your stool sample and send it to 5 different companies, you'll get 5 different results. And the reason is because they're all using different methods of analysis, both in terms of how they sequence and how they analyze the data. And you don't really know often how they're doing it. And that can make a big difference in the data interpretation and what you can expect to get back.
Is there a gold standard?
Again, it depends on the question. So if it's a stool sample, a metagenomic sequencing is kind of what we do as a gold standard. There's still some issues with that as well, but metagenomic sequencing will give you a lot more information,
right. And so the bacteria that's in the stool is highly correlated with what's in the colon?
With the colon, yeah, I would say yes, but not anywhere else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where did the kind of concept or idea of diversity come from? So there's research, Rob Knight's work that has looked at, and I know you'd be familiar with this, but just for the listeners to refresh them, it was looking at
the sort of diversity of someone's microbiome and the amount of plants in their diet. And it didn't matter. The type of diet that people were eating didn't matter, the label at all, omnivorous, whatever. But what seemed to associate with diversity was plant diversity in the diet. And a lot has, I guess, been made of that. But I guess underpinning that is first the assumption that diversity is really important. So what does that actually mean, diversity? And is it important?
Yeah. Diversity is probably the one metric in the microbiome field that everyone looks at and everyone kind of points to as more diversity being good and less diversity being bad, or loss of diversity being bad, quote unquote. And yeah, a lot of this was pioneered by Rob Knight's group. And the concept is the more different types of bacteria that you have, the more essential functions can be carried out by your gut. And also there's a lot of like redundancy in your microbiome to a degree, and there's nuances there we don't need to go into, but there's redundancy. So if you were to take a new drug or change your diet and it caused a dropout of some of your bacteria, the more diversity you have theoretically would give you a better chance of still being able to carry out those essential functions, because not just one bug, one function, that would be evolutionarily unfavorable. And so the reason is that you can still, there's balance where if one bug carrying out that same function drops out, there's another bug that can pick up, the slack. That's kind of where the concept of diversity comes from. It's an evolutionary based term that applies in in mammalian scales, but also in bacterial scales as well.
Yeah, I kind of, whenever I think about that concept, and I'm not sure if this is a good analogy, but I think of like a functioning city and having lots of people, a diverse population, different genders and people with different cultural backgrounds, and they're all able to contribute to a better functioning society, environment.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, yeah.
Okay, so what are these microbes? You've gone over a few things, but how are these microbes interacting with the host biology and affecting our health? And how do we kind of pass the whole correlation versus causation piece, and whether the kind of microbiome composition is directly contributing to certain pathologies or whether it's just an association?
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot in that question. It's sort of like where do you begin?
Let's start with what we think, how we think the microbiome is actually affecting our health, and then we can perhaps talk about the correlation versus causation piece.
So, I mean, I think it's very important in host health, but I think there's probably a hierarchy in terms of where it's the most directly impacting. So I think there are some conditions where the microbiome is a primary driver or influence, and then there's other conditions where it's secondary or tertiary to a more, bigger impacting factor. So in the gut, there's so much compelling data showing that the gut from many disease processes, whether it's IBD, Crohn's colitis, IBS, celiac is still, the jury's still out. There isn't a lot of data on that. But functional issues, bloating, gas, diarrhea, all that, we know those have a huge microbial influence on those things. And I think that's fairly indisputable, because the highest density in the gut, therefore, gut diseases would be the logical place to go. Where it starts to get murky is when you start going outside the gut. And for example, an area that it may be secondary is the gut-brain interaction, right? There are some studies maybe saying bacteria can get to the brain. I'm not sure that that's true. Bacterial metabolites produced in the gut can leave the gut and circulate in the body. And there's a lot of research showing that metabolites, or the chemicals produced by the bacteria, can leave the gut and go and circulate and influence distant sites, including the brain and the liver and fat tissue and things like that. There might be something to that.
So when you say secondary, I just want to kind of throw this back to you to make sure I'm understanding. We're saying here it's not necessarily the cause of that pathology, but it could be amplifying or contributing to the process.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Right.
So like with metabolic diseases, right? Do I think there will ever be a case where the microbiome is responsible for someone gaining weight or losing weight? Or no, I don't. I think diet and exercise and the factors that we've been studying for ages will always be the primary drivers. But the microbiome is like, can tune that, right? And your composition can either amplify or blunt one of those particular factors. And that's where I get cautious with the overhyping often of the field, is when people say this causes that, or this is, and I think it's really distinguishing, the microbiome, yes, could very well be involved, but it's probably not driving, it's working in synergy with something else. And what is that something else?
Right. Yeah, it's important to, I guess, understand that hierarchy.
Yeah.
And then be able to prioritize from there. Okay. So does food allergies, does that fall into the first bucket of primary?
Yeah. I do think that there is, and it's the way I look at it, it's primary but indirect. And so going back to the early life microbiome, I talked about how your gut is the largest immune organ in the body. So there's a lot of immune education that occurs in the gut. And food allergies are obviously being first stimulated by your GI tract, or being received by your GI tract. And so if in early life you are colonized appropriately with diverse bacteria, you're exposed to a diversity of environmental exposures, which is kind of what drives population of diverse bacteria in the gut.
What would that kind of look like?
It would be pets, living with pets. It would be playing outside, having time to interact with other kids, other adults. It's exposure. And COVIDs are going to be a really interesting, experiment in what happens 5 years from now or 10 years from now in those kids that
exposure probably dropped off a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so if you have all of those exposures, you get all of these different types of bacteria colonizing your gut and tickling your immune cells and educating them so that your immune cells don't react to self. So how is it that our immune system tolerates these trillions of bacteria, which our immune system evolved to eradicate, pathogens, but yet it tolerates the microbes in our gut? That's an evolved system, and that's through educating the immune system. So you can imagine if in early life you missed something there, or there wasn't something that got educated in the right way. Now you introduce something totally new that sets off that system that wasn't properly educated. So I think it's not the bacteria, reacting to the food and causing some antigen production. I think it's the bacteria at some critical developmental window didn't educate the immune system into self versus non-self in the right way.
And do you feel it's possible to re-educate later in life, or is there a critical window where that immune system response is a bit more malleable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly don't know.
We're not there yet.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because I bet there's people with food allergies, maybe FODMAP intolerances that are listening, and perhaps autoimmune conditions or autoimmune conditions in their family who are listening to this thinking, I wonder if there's anything I can do here.
I know. So, there's certain things that are genetic based that will have nothing to do with the microbiome, like celiac. You have a genetic mutation and you cannot tolerate the gliadin and the gluten. So there's no microbiome or immune therapy that will kind of correct that. You have to modify the diet. Things that there are also adult developed food allergy, lactose intolerance tends to occur later in life. And even with the kids who have certain food allergies, there's a process you can go through to titrate in these little amounts. It's a pretty laborious process, but you can gain tolerance for certain things again. And you can do that independent of the microbiome. So there's some suggestion, that you can, but, I think the jury's still out on how exactly that happens and how you do it.
Right. So what's happening within the microbiome where someone is experiencing FODMAP sensitivity intolerance, so they're getting bloating and gas from these certain types of sugars that are making their way down into the large intestine and kind of fermenting. What would someone's microbiome perhaps look like that's experiencing that versus someone who doesn't?
Yeah. It's a bit tricky. Those who are in the IBS, the irritable bowel syndrome space, really study this deeply. I'm not in that particular space. I study more the inflammatory conditions. But it can be a combination of small bowel overgrowth. So you're actually getting bacteria, like I mentioned earlier, fermenting in the small bowel when they shouldn't be, they should be fermenting in the gut. But even if you ferment in the gut, that can cause discomfort as well and a lot of other problems. And so what is likely happening is your composition of microbes has a higher proportion of these bacteria that really love these FODMAP, these oligosaccharides in the diet. And you might have more of them than the next person. So it's probably a compositional change there.
So it's like over fermentation, because some fermentation would occur normally, right, to produce short chain fatty acids.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
But it's there's certain food types that microbes really like to sort of break down. And people who consume like a lot of sugar alcohols, often it's kind of those types of, it's these kind of polyols that you see, and microbes really like them. And so the idea is if you stop eating them, and this is true for any dietary component, if you stop eating that component of the diet, you almost can kill off those bugs. You starve them, yeah. Right. And you reduce their numbers. You may not get rid of them totally, but you can reduce their numbers. And then that's why I say slowly titrate back. Because FODMAP is not a long-term diet. You can't stay on that forever. It's really restrictive. And it's kind of odd, like the things, it's like why this and not that.
It'd be hard to adhere to long-term.
Long-term, yeah. So you slowly start to titrate those foods back, and then you can kind of reshift, you can kind of alter your population a little bit. That's sort of the thinking behind it.
Do you think that's why, anecdotally online, there's certainly a number of people that have reported improvement in some type of either local gastrointestinal symptom like bloating or gas, or some sort of inflammatory symptom by removing all plant foods. And they're just eating animal foods.
Yeah.
Do you think this sort of FODMAP sensitivity would be playing a part in that?
Yeah. A lot of time for individuals who are experiencing a lot of the bloating, and I've witnessed this firsthand, when you remove these highly fermentable foods from the diet, you can almost eliminate many of the bloating symptoms. And so plant-based foods, but it's very personal. It's very individual. Not if you did that, if someone else eliminated all their plant-based foods, it might cause other problems in their body.
Yeah, you do hear also the case studies of crazy diarrhea and all sorts of things happening. So it can go both ways.
No, everything at the extremes, it never works in the extremes. It's really, again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, it's really about balance in the body. But it is true. Microbes, they love fiber, and fiber is a good thing to eat in terms of creating diversity of your microbiome and short chain fatty acid production, but it causes problems in other people. And so when the people who have come to me with that problem, when I tell them, okay, shift to a more, protein-based diet, protein and fat-based diet, often the symptoms go away. But it worked for that person. It may not work for the next person.
Right. And long-term, so is it a problem, you kind of alluded to it before, but a problem to restrict fiber consumption long-term, or will the microbiome adapt in a way where it will take those other foods, whatever foods, probably if they're high protein, high fat, they're animal foods, and will be able to use those as substrates to produce the compounds that person needs? Like how much adaptability is there?
So there's definitely adaptability in that if you switch to a carnivore diet and you stop eating plant foods, you will lose all of those fermenty type bugs that are adapted to plant material or grains or things like that. And you will promote the bacteria that love to consume meat-based products. And it's not necessarily that you're evolving to support microbes that are beneficial to you. It's more that you're promoting the bugs that just love that food that you're eating. It may not always be a good thing. And so fermentation of protein has been studied quite a bit, and that occurs in the colon. And the byproducts of fermentation of animal protein specifically tend to be not very good for you. And I think that could be a concern. There's a lot of sulfur components that come off of that fermentation process. They're not short chain fatty acids. Your bugs are not going to start making short chain fatty acids from protein.
Those metabolites, they're associated with certain disease states?
Yeah, people have studied them in the context of colon cancer and intestinal inflammation primarily. And there's literature on this. There isn't enough research in that space because there haven't been enough people to go on those diets.
Yeah, I saw one study, and I think it was published in Nature. I think it's about 2014 or 15. Is it David Lawrence?
Yeah.
You know the
That's
paper
sort of
I'm
a
talking
seminal.
about. It's like an animal-based versus a plant-based.
Yeah.
And I actually saw a study of yours. I think it was in mice. It was like a saturated fat versus an unsaturated fat.
Right,
I'll let you explain it. But in both of those, I found it interesting that, well, in yours, I believe the saturated fat group, and in David's paper, the animal-based group led to an increase in biophilia Wadsworthia.
Yeah, correct. It changes the bile acid composition when you shift to a more fat and mainly fat-based diet, and protein as a part of that. But both of our studies found this bile acid signature, and the bile acids are important in the body. We need them. They help us break down and emulsify fats so that we can take them up and distribute them throughout the body. There's been a lot of research on the interaction between primary and secondary bile acids in the microbiome, and research showing that conversion by microbes of secondary bile acids creates kind of carcinogenic compounds. So you always have bile. You can change the composition of it by what you eat dramatically. So if you shift to a more fat and protein-based diet, you fundamentally shift the profile to one that provides a substrate for this Balaphla wadsworthia to grow, and it produces hydrogen sulfide as a major byproduct, which is genotoxic. It causes damage to your intestines. So and that's just one example of a stepwise process where diet can shift the microbiome indirectly through changing the host chemistry. And that likely happens in multiple different processes. And so any extreme will do that, but your body works fine in down the middle. But if you go to the edges, it will usually push the system in such a way that you'll get like a real skewing of your microbiome.
Right. Yeah. So look, a couple of things for us to double click on here. I guess my first question let's finish off on these two studies and your study in particular. Was there any hypothesis? Why would saturated fats affect the microbiome differently to unsaturated?
Yeah, so it goes back to the bile acid story. So I actually had no predisposition on this one. I actually personally don't think saturated fats are really that bad in moderate consumption. Your body makes them, so you need them, obviously. But the idea behind this study was we were wondering in the obesity field, the studies that were run were based on just consuming high fat versus low fat. And so it was about quantity. And I wanted to ask, is it really quantity or is it the type of fat you consume? Which one is more important? And so we had a low fat diet. And again, this is in mice, and a high fat group. And in the high fat groups, they were all high fat, but they were either saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and then the low fat group. And we did a lard group, but it wasn't that wasn't supplemental. So we wanted to ask, okay, if you are eating a high fat diet, do either of these fats, make a difference in your gut microbiome composition? And the output was intestinal inflammation, so colitis. And we found first that it shifted the microbiome, the saturated fat specifically, to a bloom of this Balaphla wadsworthia. And so then we backtrack and said, why this bug? And if you look into the genetics of the bug and what it does, it loves bilophila. So we said, okay, it loves bile. There must be something going on with the bile acid composition of the host in response to this diet. And we did an analysis of the bile acid composition, and it was a specific type of bile acid, taurocolic acid, and it was metabolized to a type of sulfate. And we found that this sulfate, the bug we discovered was blooming, loves sulfate. And taurocolic acid was providing that to the bug. And the bug metabolizes it and produces hydrogen sulfide. So in that study, it was the reason why the saturated fat caused the bloom of the bug was because it was causing the body to produce a lot of this taurocolic acid, which was the food for the bug. And then the bug used it and created a harmful byproduct. So it was like a indirect effect on the bug, not directly bug metabolizing the fat.
Right. So if you were adopting a kind of ketogenic style diet, based on that, would you have a bias for unsaturated fats? I'm throwing you into the diet wars here.
I know.
You can choose not to answer as well.
You know, if I went solely off the study, I would say yes. Okay. But my study was just one example and of one bacterial interaction and a type of diet. And is in mice. And I think there's a lot of caveats there that, you know, I would say, maybe, I mean, the reason why I'm a little hesitant is because people ran with this. Like when they saw it, they're like, saturated fats are bad. And we were just, you know, it was not the highest level of saturated fats either. And it's really, again, about balance. That diet was all saturated fat. No one eats a diet like that. People tend to eat a blend. And as long as you eat a blend, it's okay if it's a little more saturated fat than poly, but no one's eating a purely saturated fat diet.
Yeah. Even on that Harvard paper that I mentioned before, if I was advocating for an animal-based diet and looking at that study, the diet quality could have been better.
Yeah.
There was inclusion of a lot of processed meats.
Yes.
And so, like to your earlier point, a lot of this needs to be studied a lot more. The bit about extremes is interesting. So if someone's adopting a completely plant-based diet, do you think they're possibly having a negative effect on the microbiome? So are animal foods in some way actually positively impacting the microbiome? I've never seen anyone really speak about that.
Yeah. I think, again, on the spectrum of plant-based. So if you're ultra-strict vegan versus vegetarian, you're actually still getting if you're getting some degree of, if you eat eggs or there's a gray area.
Dairy foods.
Yeah. But if you're strict vegan, and we actually ran a different study on this, the hypothesis there is yes, you're actually, just like you would if you're eating only meat, if you're eating strict vegan, you also will have dropouts in your microbiome as well, because it's a narrower spectrum of foods. So the way you beget diversity is by eating a diverse diet, and that includes the full spectrum of, I'm talking about processed foods or anything, that the full spectrum of naturally available foods. So that's the stance where I start from, is that diversity in the diet is really important for supporting gut health. So, but we were curious really about the amino acid composition. So if you are on a very strict vegan diet and you're not conscious about the diet, in terms of how you mix and combine your foods, you could skew towards an imbalance in your amino acids. Now, there are very conscious vegans who do this well, and they can create the full repertoire of amino acids, but not everyone will do this. And so in those individuals who are just eating what tastes good and not making,
conscious
decisions, are they inadvertently creating some essential amino acid imbalance? And we wanted to know whether the gut microbiome could compensate in those instances. Because what are strict vegans eating a lot of? Probably a lot of fiber.
When you say compensate, can the microbiome make those other amino acids?
Can. Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. And be absorbed.
Yeah. And be absorbed. So microbes can make the full spectrum of amino acids. Sometimes they use it for themselves or for a neighbor, and it never sees the gut. But they make them and they produce them. And so that was the question we were asking, is because you don't see a bunch of people showing up to the doctor that are strict vegans with overt deficiencies in essential amino acids. So we're curious by this observation. And so is it that the microbes are compensating in some way, utilizing what they do eat a lot of that microbes love, which is fiber? And so can your gut microbiome utilize, because you need nitrogen and you need carbon to make amino acids. So can you harvest nitrogen from the body, whether it's the mucosa or urea, and take carbon from what's already coming in through fiber and support the production of essential amino acids? And the strict vegan group was an interesting question to us, but we were more interested in parts of the world where there's overt malnutrition and protein.
Not a lot of dietary diversity.
Not a lot of dietary diversity, and specifically protein malnutrition.
Okay. And are you looking mostly at like leucine and isoleucine and thionine?
We were looking at the full spectrum of the essential amino acids. And is it really agnostic? Because what we then did was we looked at the bacteria that were differential between the protein low groups and the protein sufficient groups. And when we isolated those bugs and sequenced the genomes, we looked for what amino acids they could make, and there were a lot of the essential amino acids. And so we're still following up on those studies to actually see if we can trace the production of the amino acids into like the liver to be taken up in the body. We still don't know how much is produced and what impact that has on our bodies, if it's making a difference or not. It may not be, but the bugs can produce them. They can produce other things that we need.
Throws a whole spanner in the works with regards to determining protein requirements.
Yeah, I know. And actually, I know you had Don Lehman on the show. And we talk about this a lot and about protein requirements. And do you have to consider the microbiome in this? It's an interesting concept.
Another, I guess, topic that sometimes gets thrown up in this conversation around different foods and the microbiome and metabolites is carnitine and choline and TMA. Yeah. And I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was research that, was it Rush University? Or
at Cleveland.
Cleveland,
yeah.
Sorry. Excuse me. And they found an association, I think, between TMAO levels in the blood and cardiovascular disease. And then through other experiments, we're able to see what types of dietary constituents could increase TMA in the microbiome, which would be converted to TMAO. This has been heavily debated.
Yeah.
So I think there's probably a lot of people that are very confused about that. So what's your view on TMA?
Yeah. So those studies, the way those studies were carried out, I have to say, were very elegant. They were very beautiful in the sense that they highlighted the chemical biology of the microbiome. Okay, I'll say that. A lot of caveats in that study. And one being that what I took issue with was there's a lot of language around demonizing animal-based foods with this study. And I didn't feel that was warranted because I think salmon has a huge amount of TMA naturally in it, right? And they were promoting these types of, like avoid like red meat and, eat more Mediterranean.
Which is also conflicting with the fatty fish cardiovascular disease research, which shows a reduction in risk.
Exactly. So it wasn't black and white. Now the fact, is this process real? Yeah, this pathway is real. Microbes do it, and they produce TMA, but the conversion has to happen in the liver. The TMAO conversion has to happen in the liver. The production of TMA in and of itself isn't a problem until it's converted. That is a process that occurs. Microbes can do it. How much do you have to consume? When does it become a problem? Is it super physiological or, I haven't really followed, there hasn't been much more follow-up on it since those initial studies. But there's no question that bugs this is a process that occurs.
I guess it comes back to the correlation versus causation piece, right? Like, has it been definitively shown that TMAO is causal in cardiovascular disease?
No, that in and of itself will not cause cardiovascular disease. Again, it's one of these very heterogeneous things. Like I said, is the microbiome going to be a driver in certain diseases, or is it going to be a secondary synergistic effect? It falls in the category of potentially synergistic to every other lifestyle factor that you may be participating in that contributes to heart disease. So I think that if you are doing all these other things wrong and you have high levels of TMAO, then it could be a problem. But that in and of itself causing cardiovascular disease, I'd be hard pressed to.
Right. Yeah. I think another piece of evidence that I saw that sort of made me think it might be a bit of a red herring was there was some genetic data, Mendelian randomization data, looked at people with elevated TMAO levels or TMA, and didn't seem to increase their risk of cardiovascular disease. Okay, I guess.
I think they did a follow-up where they looked at people who then had cardiovascular disease and then looked to see if they had high levels of TMAO. And I think they did. But again, it's a reverse causation sort of thing. But it's compelling. It's interesting. But, you know.
I like how you built that study up and complemented it before you crushed it. That was nice.
Because there are some aspects of that study I teach from an experimental design standpoint. In that the experimental design from a animal and things like that were it was kind of a nice way that they tried to show this. That I would say there's some bigger, more splashy studies that leap over all these other steps just to get to point Z.
"30-30-30." I've mentioned it a few times. People are probably thinking, what the hell are they talking about by this point? So what is the 30-30-30 study that you're planning? And then perhaps we can jump in and talk to the specific elements of this framework that, as we just mentioned, are kind of aimed at reducing that hunger gap and I guess essentially making it easier for people to lose weight and keep it off.
And kind of going back to the implementation part of it. So as we've mentioned several times now, lifestyle change is difficult, and some people do really well for a little bit, but then wane at their motivation or life happens or whatever. So trying to come up with something that is simple for them to follow, definitely based on evidence that we have from studies that show we can help people with satiety through what they're choosing to eat. Obviously, lots of evidence about the benefits of exercise, some of what we've talked about already today. So it's really looking at a program that was Kevin's idea, and he can share his other acronym that he shares, but I can never remember. But 30-30-30 is way easier. So 30 grams of protein per meal, 30 grams of fiber per day, and 30 minutes of exercise per day is our 30-30-30.
I love that you chose 3 things that I think are the least controversial of, I mean, there's still controversy probably in certain
I'm sure there
extreme ends of the nutrition world. Maybe in the fiber element, there's carnivores saying you don't need any fiber, and there's probably some people that are staunchly opposed to protein. But generally, most people would agree getting enough protein in the diet, enough fiber, and exercise are three kind of good first steps.
Yes.
And the idea is to deal with both sides of the energy balance equation. And so we've got pretty good evidence that higher protein in a meal will produce satiation, and then satiety lasts a longer period of time. So you feel full longer.
Can we just quickly define satiety, satiation, and hunger? Because I know we're throwing those around.
Right. And these are they're related, but different concepts. So satiety is sort of a feeling of fullness. You've eaten enough. So satiation is the process of moving from, wanting to eat to feeling full. Satiety is sort of how long that lasts. Hunger is that you have a physiological drive to eat. I want food now. So when we do studies to look at appetite, we ask 4 questions. We ask, how full do you feel? How hungry do you feel? What is your desire to eat? And then if you were to eat now, how much do you think you would eat? Prospective consumption. And these are related concepts, but people who really specialize in this area will tell you that they're not identical, and you can have situations where you have desire to eat, but you're not really hungry. You can have other situations where you have a feeling of fullness, and it's not connected exactly to hunger or desire to eat. So, they are related, but most people understand, kind of the physiological sensation of hunger. And most people also understand that desire to eat is not always connected to hunger. So the old, example of that is, there's always room for pie,
Yeah, it happens to me every night.
Yeah.
If I'm on the couch watching Netflix,
Right.
I've eaten enough food, I'm not hungry, but for whatever reason, I'll go to the kitchen and grab something else to eat.
Exactly. And, after 4 p.m., average American consumes more than 50% of their calories after 4 p.m. So they tend to graze through the evening. So it's not because they're ravenously hungry after 4 p.m. It's because they're lonely, bored.
Watching TV.
You're watching TV and something to do with your hands.
Right, exactly.
So,
And it becomes a habit, a routine.
a routine. So with protein, there's an interesting relationship of protein to hunger and fullness. And what we've found, and not everybody agrees with this, so I have to say that, very well-known people in the field, say, no, you're full of it.
I just wrote down Barbara Rolls' name.
Yep.
So we'll come back.
So actually, this is going to be very much related to the fiber component, especially. But with protein, what we found is that if you add protein in exchange for carbohydrate in a meal, you will get more satiation and greater satiety, less hunger.
Is that any type of carbohydrate or refined carbs?
It seems to be any kind of carbohydrate, but it's tied into the fiber component, so it's a little bit complicated. But for the most part, the studies are generally replacing refined carbohydrates, starches, and sugars with protein. And what we found is that under 20 grams in a meal doesn't move the needle at all. When you get beyond 20 grams, you start to see this satiating effect. And when you get beyond 30 grams, it's always there. And it doesn't really seem to be related to the person's body weight. I would have expected that maybe a person who's 240 pounds would require 40 grams of protein, whereas somebody who's 120 pounds maybe requires only 15 grams of protein. But that's not what we've seen. We've seen that we always see the effect when we get to 30 grams of protein or more.
So there's some type of nutrient sensing that's independent of your body weight.
Yes. So that seems to be the case, at least based on the studies that we've done. So when you replace carbohydrate with protein, you get more satiety. And so that's part of the story. And the question is why? Well, Arne Astrup and colleagues in Scandinavia, they have done studies on this, and they show this dose-response effect. When you increase protein as an exchange for carbohydrate, you get a higher GLP-1 response. And then there's an interesting thing, which is that the L cells in the small intestine are not evenly distributed. And so you have more of them later on in the small intestine. And so if you can delay protein digestion until later in the small intestine, that seems to help increase that GLP-1 response. Now, GLP-1 is complicated because we know with GLP-1 receptor agonists, you're talking about supraphysiologic levels. But then there's a class of drugs called the DPP-4 inhibitors, and they basically just slow down the breakdown of GLP-1.
Is that acarbose or is that?
No, acarbose is an alpha-glucosidase inhibitor. Yeah. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, let's come back to that, because now that you're talking about protein getting to the end of the small intestine, thinking about ways to slow down digestion.
Yeah, exactly. So GLP-1 is released. These L cells are releasing GLP-1, but GLP-1 has like a 2-minute half-life, and it's mostly having effects locally. But there's a lot of connection between the gut and the brain. So you release GLP-1, that stimulates the vagus nerve, sends signals up to the brain, and then you actually release GLP-1 in the brain. But of course, that's hard to study in humans, hard to get people to volunteer for, brain biopsies and such. So,
which presumably then dampens the drive to eat.
Right.
Dampens the drive to eat. And that's what Arne Astrup and others have shown, that you get this larger GLP-1 response. You also have GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, also known as gastric inhibitory peptide. And
I won't ask you to spell that one.
Yeah, GLP-1, GIP response go up with more protein. So I think we have, reasonable evidence to support that view, even though not everyone agrees with it. And so with more protein in a meal, you get more satiety, but you have to get to 30 grams of protein to consistently see that effect.
So you got to get to 30 grams, and then it's improved if you are able to slow down gastric emptying?
Yes. So, slow down digestion of the protein. And so that's where some of the fiber comes in. So as an example, viscous fibers, like what you get in, viscous fibers that you might take as a laxative.
Like a psyllium husk or something.
Psyllium husk. I try not to use, brand names, but I'll say the brand name Metamucil that most people are familiar with. And so that creates a gel in the intestine. And so it slows down digestion because it protects the food from digestive enzymes. It just creates a barrier, and they don't digest as quickly. And so it slows down digestion of carbohydrates and proteins. And so then you digest the proteins more slowly, you get more protein reaching those L cells, and a higher GLP-1 response. That's a hypothesis. And then there's another element to it, which is for fat, which stimulates CCK release. CCK is a protein that slows gastric emptying. There's also a hypothesis that when you have viscous fiber in combination with fat, that is causing the fat to be in contact with the intestinal wall longer and gives you a higher CCK response, which slows gastric emptying. So protein and fiber may be synergistic in terms of helping to control appetite. And then there are other things as well that we can talk about separately, which is they also affect the other side of the energy balance equation, energy expenditure.
Yeah, let's make sure we get to that. I think it was on our Zoom call that we did. That was the first time I'd heard anyone talk about this interaction between protein and fiber in the same meal with regards to how it affects appetite.
Right. And I will say that we need a lot more studies. So these are hypotheses. They're somewhat supported by the studies that we've done, but we need a lot more to be more confident that this is really happening.
What does that look like from a food point of view perspective? If someone's listening and thinking, okay, I've got a good idea what 30 grams of protein looks like, and then the 30 grams of fiber, I'm presuming, is not per meal. That's across a day.
That's across a day.
Let's make that clear.
Yeah.
I was like, I thought I said day. Yeah, but definitely a day.
There's you mentioned there, there's viscous fiber. Fiber is an umbrella term, although sometimes it could be confused for a single thing. There's lots of different types of fiber, right. Viscous, non-viscous, fermentable, non-fermentable. Is the simple guide of just getting 30 grams from a variety of plants, is that enough to sort of satisfy the body's requirement for viscous fiber and these different types? Or does the individual need to be a little more specific and perhaps including certain foods?
That would take the simplicity away, Simon.
It would.
So we're trying to make
it would
this...
be the next step underneath the 30-30-30 framework.
And honestly, like 30, 42, 30, that's just, people don't have our time with that. So 30, 30, 30 is a simplification. We like to make it as simple as is practical.
Right.
And I should also say for each of these, it's at least 30 grams of protein per meal, at least 30 grams of fiber per day, at least 30 minutes of exercise per day.
But you're right. The protein part, I think it will be fairly simple, although I think some people would struggle as well. So giving them options in terms of a protein supplement or something like that. But I think with fiber, just getting people to consume higher fiber foods is going to be important. And we're considering, maybe we do consider a fiber supplement to get them to the 30 gram minimum.
And in particular, there are, several foods like oats and barley, for instance, that have viscous fiber. But, to get the amounts of fiber that we're talking about is a bit of a challenge. It can certainly be done with food alone, but I think supplementation with something like Metamucil, as an example, might be helpful as well, just to make it more practical to do.
What do you think is better in terms of hunger? I guess what we're thinking about here is the kind of outcome of interest. Psyllium husk, methyl cellulose, guar gum. There's a few different options out there. Is there any kind of clear winner when it comes to the research?
Well, they have differences. So methyl cellulose and hydroxypropylmethylcellulose, they are very viscous, but they're not fermentable. Psyllium husk is very viscous, not very fermentable. Guar, on the other hand, is viscous and fermentable. And then you've got some other fibers, pectin and acacia gum. So pectin is more similar to guar. Acacia gum is not very viscous, but very fermentable. So optimally, I'd like to see people getting enough viscous fiber and enough fermentable fiber, because fermentable fibers have other effects metabolically that I think are important. And so we want to see a balance between viscous and fermentable. And, again, we want to try and simplify it. So in our study, it'll probably be, lists of foods with sort of, fiber per serving, and saying, choose one from column A, choose one from column B, etc.
With the option of a supplement, perhaps.
Right.
So on that fermentable piece, I think something that we also spoke about was on our Zoom call was that as people age, LDL cholesterol tends to go up, ApoB tends to go up, and you had some thoughts that perhaps this is explained by a reduction in propionate, a short chain fatty acid,
right,
if I recall correctly.
Yep.
So am I right in thinking here that your hypothesis is that a fermentable fiber might increase propionate and then through that help reduce cholesterol?
So that's one element of it. So fermentable fibers will be fermented down to short chain fatty acids, and they're absorbed. Now, part of it is some short chain fatty acids will go into the intestinal cells and be used for energy there. Others will be absorbed into the circulation, and acetate and propionate both affect cholesterol metabolism. And so acetate, see if I can remember correctly, acetate stimulates cholesterol synthesis. Propionate inhibits the effect of acetate to stimulate cholesterol synthesis. And so as people age, their gut microflora changes, and they produce less propionate, and so they have less of the inhibition of the effect of acetate to increase cholesterol synthesis. So by consuming more fermentable fiber, you both increase the gut microflora that are involved in fermentation, and then you're also increasing the production of propionate, which may be helpful for cholesterol metabolism. Now, having said that, it's not a huge effect. So I think some of the other effects of short-chain fatty acids are more metabolically important. Two are when you get short-chain fatty acid release, you seem to have stimulation of brown fat that increases energy expenditure. And then you also have inhibition of lipolysis in fat cells. So you reduce the release of free fatty acids. And so if you consume a fermentable fiber in the evening, you'll have lower levels of free fatty acids overnight, and that will tend to increase insulin sensitivity in the morning.
And so you could achieve that through food or a supplement like guar gum?
Yep.
Interesting. The other fiber or prebiotic that you mentioned was beta-glucans.
So beta-glucan, which is in oats and barley and some other things, is both viscous and fermentable. And so I really like beta-glucan because it has both of those properties. And so it helps to slow down digestion of starches and proteins. And then in addition to that, it's fermentable. And so you get this short-chain fatty acid release. So I'm a big fan of beta-glucan. Also, we've done a lot of studies with beta-glucan. And so with viscous fibers, they lower cholesterol levels, and we know how that works. Mainly, it's by trapping cholesterol and bile acids in the intestine and carrying them out. Bile acids are made from cholesterol, so if you carry them out, they don't get reabsorbed and recirculated, so you have to make more, and so that takes cholesterol. And then, of course, cholesterol, if you carry that out, less of it gets absorbed, and only about 10% of the cholesterol that goes through the gut every day comes from the diet. Most of it comes endogenously, and it's, dumped into the small intestine in bile. And so you have free cholesterol that's dumped in, it's reabsorbed. And so if you can prevent some of that, you can reduce cholesterol levels. So it acts in a way similar to the drug ezetimibe, which is a cholesterol absorption inhibitor, and similar to bile acid sequestrants.
Got you. So the fiber sort of carries out some of the cholesterol that's in the intestine.
Right.
And the body's response to that is the liver, we need more cholesterol. Let's pull it in out of the blood.
Pull it in out of the blood. We need more.
Create more bile. And in doing that, LDL cholesterol comes down
exactly
in the blood. Okay, cool. So that's fiber, 30 grams per day. And that can be achieved through food alone or food plus supplements. Some of these viscous and fermentable fibers might be the best option from a supplement point of view. Is there any, and actually I know there is, because I think I read a paper of yours on this, if someone was to increase their fiber intake by 5 grams, 10 grams a day, what kind of effect could that have on their risk of developing a disease like atherosclerosis? Can we quantify that?
I'm not sure we can quantify it right now, but we can talk about effects on risk factors. So if you consume viscous fiber with a meal, you reduce the glycemic load of the meal. You do something similar to changing the meal from a high glycemic index to a low glycemic index by slowing down the digestion and absorption. So that's an element of it. And reducing glycemic load, we know, is associated with less risk for developing diabetes. Then also you lower cholesterol levels. And so we know that lowering cholesterol levels reduces the risk. And when I say cholesterol, that's a surrogate really for ApoB lipoproteins. And so Dr. Lipid, Tom Dayspring, he's absolutely right. And we should be focusing on atherogenic particles, the ApoB lipoproteins. And so viscous fiber lowers those. And so there are effects that on risk factors. Also, by reducing the insulin response, one of the things that insulin does is it causes reabsorption of sodium in the kidneys. And so by reducing the insulin response, that also has favorable effects on blood pressure. Not necessarily, in everybody, and it's not a huge effect, but you're affecting multiple risk factors in ways that you would expect to be favorable.
And so the net effect, which is hard to quantify, is a kind of stacking of all of those individual benefits.
Exactly.
That someone's getting. In terms of someone kind of actioning this in their lifestyle, getting more fiber into their diet, what's your kind of recommendations for how they think about that when they're at the grocery store?
Well, as we have discussed on prior episodes, there is this one central rule to gut health that just is critically important, and we all need to do it. And the problem is that our food system will not do it for us. So ultimately, it becomes imperative that you consciously make these choices. And the choice is to eat a wide variety of plants. Diversity of plants has now been repeatedly shown, including in our own work at Zoe, has been repeatedly shown to be the number one independent predictor of a healthy gut microbiome. And in the original study, which was called the American Gut Project, in that study, the people with the healthiest guts were eating at least 30 different varieties of plants per week. Now, plants are not just vegetables. This is fruits, vegetables, whole grains, seeds, nuts, and legumes. Every single one of them counts towards that number. And by the way, don't stop at 30. I know in the past, you've had the plant proof 40. You've recommended people strive towards 40. And what I say is, look, wherever you are, the average American right now is probably eating 8 or 10 plants per week. Like that salad with iceberg lettuce and 1 tomato is not currently cutting it. And so we need to increase.
Let's get a bit more adventurous.
Yeah. And don't put pressure on yourself to have to hit this magical threshold of 30. If you go from 10 to 20, you're doing amazing work. Your microbes thank you. And if you go from 20 to 30, even better. And we can keep cranking this up and get yourself to a place where you're thinking about this when you go to the supermarket, or you're in the kitchen cooking, or you're creating a plate for dinner. You hear either me or Simon Hill, our voice, or us collectively saying diversity of plants in your ear in a non-creepy way. And you do it. And then this is like how we ultimately achieve more fiber, but also better gut health.
So we're eating for ourselves, we're eating for our microbes. And when we do that, they're going to reward us.
They reward us with short chain fatty acids. And then short chain fatty acids do magical things like release GLP-1 and peptide YY. This is just one example of what they do. We can keep going.
Right. Well, the second thing that you mentioned on your list there was related to fat storage, fat metabolism, and how that affects energy balance. So explain that connection between the microbiome and fat metabolism.
Yes. So our body is conditioned for survival. And it evolved in a setting of food scarcity. So like one of the top threats to human existence throughout humanity has been whether or not you can achieve an adequate amount of food intake to actually continue to survive. So we have this very strong drive towards collecting food. And we have this ability of our body to basically store fat so that we have it for later to protect ourselves from these moments of time where there's food scarcity, like it could be the winter time if we were hunters and gatherers. This is the way that our physiology was created, and it starts to work against us. We call this antagonistic pleiotropy. Antagonistic pleiotropy basically means that like the things that we evolved to have because they were advantageous for us in the past have now become disadvantageous. We're either in a state of storing fat or consuming the fat. Consuming, like an alternative word, could be metabolizing fat. And we're constantly flipping between these two things. And so now, obviously, when we talk about the state of America, where, basically more than 70%, like roughly 75% of Americans are either obese or overweight, then clearly the pendulum is swinging very hard towards fat storage. And we need to bring the pendulum back to the other side and start consuming and metabolizing some of this fat. And one of the ways that we can accomplish this is through the byproduct of fiber, meaning the short chain fatty acids. And once again, the reason why we're talking about this is because you can't get short chain fatty acids on the level that we're discussing without these microbes. These microbes have to do it for us. So this is a microbiome effect. But the animal model studies indicate to us, Simon, that when you have increased short chain fatty acids, there's a couple things that happen. One of the things that's kind of interesting and I think cool is it activates the brown fat. Brown fat, it sounds like, oh, brown fat, that's bad. No, actually brown fat's good.
Metabolically active.
This is metabolically active fat. This is fat that helps our body to actually consume fat in other areas. And that's because it sets the tone, it beats the drum for our body temperature. So one of the ways that you can activate brown fat so that you can basically like increase your metabolism and burn more energy is through cold exposure. This is why people are doing cold plunges these days. Activate the brown fat, basically force your body temperature up and burn more calories. Well, the other way that you can activate the brown fat is by consuming fiber. Short chain fatty acids activate the brown fat. In addition to activating the brown fat, short chain fatty acids also block the uptake of fatty acids into the fat cells, meaning that you are stopping that process of creating more fat that we were talking about. And then the last thing is that actually short chain fatty acids have been demonstrated once again in animal models to increase our metabolism in the sense of energy metabolism. So we are burning more energy as a result of short chain fatty acids. So when you take all of these things in combination, you think about this, we're like basically stopping stuff from adding more fat, we're simultaneously activating the brown fat. We're trying to energize our body and create more consumption of fat. This is how we reduce our fat stores.
And then the third thing that you mentioned was gut barrier function.
Yes. So anyone who's listened to our conversations in the past knows that when we talk about the gut, we have to talk about the gut barrier. There is this single layer of cells, it's called the epithelial layer, that basically lines our gut, and it stops things from getting into our bloodstream that aren't supposed to be there. And the specific thing that I'm talking about is called lipopolysaccharide, which can also be called bacterial endotoxin. It's produced by gram-negative bacteria, nasty bacteria like E. coli and things like that. And it's meant to stay inside our intestines where it's really not causing a huge problem. But when it crosses this barrier, when we break down the barrier, when we disrupt the junctions, the tight junctions that hold the barrier together, and we create these channels, then what happens is this lipopolysaccharide gets free access to our bloodstream. And this is problematic because this, number one, activates inflammation. It activates inflammation throughout the entire body. So if you check like a systemic inflammatory marker, you will see higher levels of inflammation. A measure this could be like a CRP. By the way, for people who use wearable technology, there's some markers of inflammation that you could also look at. Your resting heart rate is one of them. So like your heart rate overnight at night and how high that is, or ideally how low. And another is your HRV, which is your heart rate variability. So we want a high HRV, and the heart rate variability is, again, sort of something that correlates very strongly with sort of what is the inflammatory profile of your body. So anyway, lipopolysaccharide activates inflammation. By the way, there are some specific organs that end up getting involved in this inflammation from lipopolysaccharide. One are the fat cells. Second is the liver. Third is the pancreas. I want people to remember fat, liver, pancreas. And by the way, the fourth one are the muscle cells. These are the 4 critical places that we're going to talk about in a moment when it comes to glucose metabolism and insulin resistance. But in this particular setting, this inflammation is actually problematic because what we're doing is we're creating insulin resistance, and simultaneously we are promoting obesity. And if you take an animal model, they have these studies where they actually inject lipopolysaccharide into a mouse. By simply injecting this lipopolysaccharide, you can make the mouse insulin resistant, diabetic, and obese. And if we look at this, in terms of, okay, so lipopolysaccharide can potentially have this problem. Well, if you take a look at some of these specific groups of people, phenotypes, take a look at the microbiome of a person who's obese. Take a look at the microbiome of a person who has type 2 diabetes. Take a look at the microbiome of a person who has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And what you find in all cases is that there is dysbiosis and increased intestinal permeability in all of those cases.
Right. So this, bringing this back to how this is occurring, that fence, the gut lining that separates the bacteria from us. We have spoken about this in previous episodes, but remind us, what is it that can lead to that sort of disruption of the tight junctions and separation that allows the LPS to enter the bloodstream?
When the gut microbiome is in a healthy place, it's able to repair and restore that gut barrier. So they're kind of the stewards of taking care of this for us. If the fence gets broken down, they'll fix the fence. But when the gut microbiome is not in a good place, if the fence gets broken down, there's no one to come and fix it. And so this is what we call dysbiosis. And in the setting of dysbiosis, the typical findings that we see are a loss of diversity within the microbes. So you have less species of the microbes, less balance within the microbial system. And when I say less balance, also what you see is less of the good guys, which are the butyrate or short chain fatty acid producing microbes. Those are the good ones that we want. And you see more of these inflammatory microbes that start to pop in. So, one thing I should mention real quick, Simon, is I mentioned that if you inject lipopolysaccharide into an animal model, that they will develop not only obesity, but insulin resistance. There's actually research in humans with insulin resistance, and I know we're going to talk about insulin resistance more in a moment, but since we're talking about energy balance, I feel like I have to say this here. Again, like these things are intertwined, but there's research actually in children where it's kind of, I find this compelling. They took a group of overweight kids and they took them to a buffet and they looked to see who was overeating. And they discovered that the number one predictor of overeating among these kids was actually insulin resistance. Yeah. So it kind of ties together because insulin resistance, again, these things don't operate in isolation, is going to also be tied to this metabolic disturbance where you don't have adequate levels of GLP-1 and peptide YY. So you're not getting satiated after a meal. So then you eat more.
But also gut barrier function.
Yes. So all these things are sort of in play at the same time. And this is part of the reason why these drugs like Wegovy are effective, is that you're helping to sort of disrupt this vicious cycle that's happening.
This talk of gut barrier function reminds me of a conversation I had with Justin and Erica Sonnenberg. And his acronym MAX?
No, what is it?
Microbiota accessible carbohydrates.
Oh, yeah.
Right. That's what he uses in his published studies. And he was talking about when you are consuming a fiber deplete diet, so you don't have these microbiota accessible carbohydrates. I didn't know that the mucosal layer actually contains carbohydrates, and the microbes can actually start feasting and breaking that down.
Yeah, it will actually thin out.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that also plays into this gut barrier function sort of breakdown.
It does, because actually that mucus layer that you're describing is intended to be a barrier against inflammatory microbes. Mm-hmm. They have what's called bactericidins, which are antimicrobial within that barrier. And so if you break that down, then you are breaking down one of the protective mechanisms that stops the lipopolysaccharide from getting to the bloodstream.
To summarize, the best things that you can do for your gut are eat a wide, colorful variety of plant foods, aiming to consume 30 or more unique plant foods per week. Include fermented foods daily. Even a small serving will make a difference. Support your gut beyond food with healthy lifestyle habits, which means moving your body regularly, prioritizing quality sleep, and actively managing your stress. And the worst, overusing antibiotics, especially without prehab or a recovery plan, relying on ultra-processed, low-fiber foods, and eating a high-saturated fat, low-fiber diet. Remember, your gut microbiome is like a garden. Water it with plants, fertilize it with prebiotics, and protect it from pests like ultra-processed foods and stress. With the right inputs, which is a decision that we all get to make every single time we eat, it flourishes. With the wrong inputs, it becomes depleted and out of balance.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.